In late 2025, something pretty dramatic happened. While one nation's capital was literally on fire, its closest neighbor was watching, nervously, right across the water. This is a story about that fire next door, and, maybe more importantly, about the wake-up call it sent to any country that thinks stability is something you can just take for granted. So let's get right to the heart of it. On one side of the map, you've got Jakarta. The air there wasn't just hot, it was thick, with anger, with protests, and yeah, with actual flames licking at government buildings. And then, just a stone's throw away, you've got Kuala Lumpur, watching its neighbor's democracy go up in smoke and asking a really scary question. Could those same sparks drift across the strait and land here? All right, so to really get what that warning means, we have to understand the fire itself. So let's dive in and dissect the anatomy of what exactly happened in Indonesia. Now, this is absolutely crucial. This whole crisis wasn't some random, spontaneous explosion. The sources we're looking at describe it as a perfect storm, and it was made of three very specific ingredients: a spark, a whole lot of fuel, and one tragic catalyst. Remember that formula, because it's the key to understanding everything that follows. So, what was the spark that lit the fuse? It was this number right here, 50 million rupiah. That was the proposed monthly housing allowance for every single member of Indonesia's parliament.
And this is where that number just becomes a jaw-dropping symbol of the disconnect. For a lawmaker, it's a perk. But for an ordinary citizen, that's anywhere from 10 to 20 times their entire monthly minimum wage. And to propose this during a massive cost of living crisis, well, one source called the timing spectacularly bad. I'd say that's an understatement. And if that huge number was the spark, the fuel was years of simmering public anger. And you know what? Nothing captures the sheer tone deafness of the political class better than this quote, reportedly from a lawmaker to a protester. It's the kind of remark that does more than just make people mad. It confirms their absolute worst fear, that the whole system is rigged against them.
But look, this wasn't just about one insensitive comment. No, the fuel for this fire had been piling up for a long time. Just think about it. You've got a shrinking middle class, 10 million people falling backwards economically. You have austerity measures slashing funds for things like education. And underneath it all, a deep, corrosive distrust in what people saw as a system of collusive elite bargains. Public patience was already stretched to its breaking point.
So you have this spark, and you have all this fuel. The only thing missing was the catalyst. And that came on August 28th with the tragic death of Afan Kurniawan, a 21-year-old delivery driver. A video of him being struck by a police vehicle went viral, and that changed everything. What started as a protest over lawmaker perks in late August just exploded into a nationwide movement against state brutality. By early September, it had spread to over 100 cities.
Okay, so with this inferno just raging in Jakarta, let's turn our attention to its neighbor. How is Malaysia seeing these flames? Was this just a distant problem on the news, or was it like looking in a mirror and seeing a scary reflection?
Now, if you just glance at the surface, Malaysia might look a whole lot more stable. But the data here tells a more complicated story. Let's look past the GDP numbers for a second. Check out the risk of mass protest. Indonesia is high, sure, but look where Malaysia is, right behind it, medium high. You add in weak elite accountability, and you start to realize the foundations in both countries aren't nearly as different as you might think.
And that's the absolute crux of it. Kuala Lumpur wasn't on fire, but it wasn't exactly calm either. The sources describe a nation that was dealing with its own smoldering embers, and these were the exact same kinds of frustrations that fueled the massive fire right next door.
And these embers, they're going to sound eerily familiar. A cost of living crisis squeezing household budgets, public patience wearing thin, which you could see clearly in that Resign Anwar rally, a growing distrust in government institutions, and big controversies over transparency, like a major procurement bill getting rushed through Parliament without much debate. See what I mean? The parallels are impossible to ignore. And just like Afan Kurniawan's death became this huge symbol in Indonesia, Malaysia had its own tragic catalyst for public mistrust. The hashtag Justice for Zara movement, a grassroots campaign demanding answers for the death of a 13-year-old girl, became this incredibly powerful, social media-fueled symbol of the public's loss of faith in the state's ability to deliver justice. It was a clear, heartbreaking echo from across the strait.
So with all these parallels, what's the lesson here? What are you supposed to do with this information? Well, the sources distill this whole crisis down into 4 clear, actionable lessons for Malaysia, basically a roadmap for stability that's pulled directly from the ashes of Jakarta's unrest.
So the prescription that comes out of this is a 4-part strategy.
First, you have to tackle economic inequality head-on. Second, you have to pair that with restoring public trust through real, honest-to-goodness transparency. Third, you need meaningful police reform to guarantee accountability. And finally, and this might be the most important part of all, you have to practice responsive governance. Basically, listen to people's legitimate problems before they feel like they have no choice but to start screaming.
And this really is the bottom line. According to the analysis, these 4 steps aren't just some nice ideas or optional policies, they are a strategic imperative. Think of them as the fire extinguishers that can prevent those smoldering embers we talked about from turning into an uncontrollable inferno.
Which brings us to our final and most critical point. This whole situation presents a very clear choice, not just for Malaysia, but really for any democracy in the region. It's a crossroads with 2 very, very different futures down each path.
On one side, you have the proactive path. This is where you address the root causes, where you build trust, and where you strengthen the system for the long haul. On the other side, though, is the reactive path. Dismiss people's real problems, use crackdowns and repression, and you end up creating this vicious cycle of instability. And tragically, Indonesia's government, by trying to mix some concessions with harsh crackdowns, showed everyone just how dangerous that reactive path can be.
One of the sources puts what's at stake in some pretty stark, sobering terms. In Southeast Asian democracy, avoiding catastrophic failure counts as success. It's a powerful reminder that this is often a high-wire act. Success isn't about being perfect. Sometimes it's just about not falling off the wire.
And that leads us to our final question. The fire in Indonesia and the embers of Malaysia show us that stability and unrest, they're not just random acts of nature. So you have to ask, is a nation's future a matter of chance, or is it a direct consequence of the choices or the failures to choose made by the people in power?